While only in February, the concerns about little moisture are easy to understand based off last year's impact in fields across the state. Some irrigators, like those along the Republican River and in the Panhandle, face water allocations of acre inches per year. We recently talked with Derrel Martin about what has worked and what hasn't worked for those situations with deficit irrigation.
Deficit irrigation generally means when you don't have a large enough water supply to irrigate your entire acreage to achieve a maximum yield or an attainable yield for that field.
Why are the reasons that people either have to or want to do this?
Yeah, well, one big reason is that a large part of the western half of the state is now under a water allocation program where the amount of water that they can pump on either a given year or over multiple years is limited by regulation. And so then they have to make a choice on how they manage that. There's a few other NRDs in the eastern part of the state are also looking at maybe some limitations on the volume of water you could pump.
You see that moving further east, the allocation?
Well, that's certainly the way it's going. I won't predict that it's going to necessarily happen in some of the eastern NRDs, but I know some are just looking at it in some areas of the NRD this year, and other ones are starting to think about that.
Let's take a look at some of the things that people have done or people are thinking about doing to maybe maximize what they can for water. And some of them, you say they're short-term. They're short-term fixes like only planting in certain areas or switching crops completely. Why are those short-term fixes and why might they not be the best decisions to make?
Well, a common thing that we get is people think about, instead of planting corn, they think about planting a crop that maybe requires less irrigation for the year to produce that full yield. But what we find is the productivity of corn is so high. We get so many bushels of corn per unit of what we call evapotranspiration, which is water that either evaporates or transpires. It's very, very steep for corn, which means there's a high value for the water that's used by corn. So many times it's more attractive to stress corn a little bit or some rather than planting some other crop and producing the maximum yield, because you're just not getting as much value out of the water.
What about only planting in, maybe that area, that circle that the irrigation would go, or the area that you're irrigating?
Yeah, that's another common question that we receive. People think that maybe instead of having 130 acres, maybe I'll plant 100 acres and go for maximum yield on that 100 acres. But when we analyze that, what we really find is that in a dry year, it doesn't make that much difference whether you have the 130 acres and some reduced yield versus 100 acres and a full yield. But producers also need to think about what happens in a year that turns out to be a little bit more rainfall than they thought. Then they've given up the earning potential of that 30 acres that they might have idled. And many times that lost opportunity is more significant than what the impact might have been in the dry year, actually.
What are the longer term things? What are things that the people who have been in this situation for a long time have had success doing?
Well, the things that they've done is one, they've become as efficient as they can. And frankly, I like the way we do it in the state where the NRD will set an allocation, growers know what they can pump, they get more efficient, and then maybe the NRD has to reduce that allocation to manage the watershed. But every time we do this, just the innovation of producers, we get much more efficient. We get a lot more value out of that water.
Efficient in what way?
Well, how much of the water that you pump is actually used by your crop? That's really the ultimate goal for the farmer, is to have as much water as they pump as possible to go to the crop. So reducing runoff, reducing water that percolates through the root zone, those kinds of things tend to improve the ability of that farmer to make the most value of that water. In
that sense, do you recommend things like soil water sensors or simple things like leaving crop residue on to try and trap moisture there?
Yeah, absolutely. Reduced tillage, especially the fact that we're almost 85% of the irrigated lands with center pivots today. Certainly the center pivot works very well with reduced tillage, and you take advantage of all of those factors. Monitoring soil moisture in these conditions can be helpful. Mostly what it can let them do is delay when they first irrigate in the spring a little longer than they might normally do that. And they might be able to catch a rain then in the spring that they wouldn't have had to put the water on. And so the reason you monitor soil water in the eastern Nebraska where we don't have those allocations is to reduce the amount of water you pump. But when you're allocated how much water you have to pump, it's really when's the best time to use that water during the year.
I'll end with this. If you're trying to do it based on the ideal time to stress the crop or putting the crop through a little bit of stress and then irrigating, what are the pluses and minuses or benefits and drawbacks to that?
Yeah, what a lot of our research has shown is that you want to avoid severe stress during that tassel reproductive stage, silking period. You also have to think about how much well capacity you have. That is, how many gallons per minute your well produces per acre of land. And so if you have a well that has a really high water supply, you can maybe wait till maybe a week or two before that tasseling, a couple weeks before tasseling. If I have a smaller water supply, then I probably want to get ahead of the curve a little bit and store some water in the soil so that it can carry me through that sensitive time.
Does the same type of thing apply for pod fill and soybeans, perhaps?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
That R3, R4 stage is important in eastern Nebraska. In western Nebraska, we might need to irrigate soybeans a little bit earlier because we don't have as much rain and maybe not as much soil water carryover. So in the western half of the state, we may want to look at beans a little bit early in the year.
If you're interested in learning more about deficit irrigation, we'll post a link on the Market Journal website to a recent Crop Watch story on UNL's deficit irrigation workshop. There are also a series of no-till deficit irrigation and water optimizer workshops planned in western Nebraska next week. The dates and locations are Tuesday the 26th in Sidney, the 27th in Alliance, and the 28th in Scottsbluff. You're encouraged to RSVP to the local county extension office.